Citizen TV.
All right, sir, thanks so much for that. On that note, walking over to the bench to greet my good friend. I've known him for more than 25 years. By the way, he's the only African leader to have been head of state twice in the span of 20 years. First time in 1976, when the former military leader, Murtala Mohammed, was gunned down in the streets of Lagos. The number 2 took over. His name was Olusegun Obasanjo. Ruled for 3 years, gave up power to a civilian government, went away, came back 20 years later, was elected again as a democratically elected president in 1999, served for 2 terms. He's no doubt a legend on the continent. I've known him for this long, and it's good to see you, Baba. Welcome back to Kenya.
Yes, nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
You haven't changed at all.
Your flattery will get you everywhere. So listen, why are you here? Why did you come?
Yeah, I came in for a youth convention. The Kenyan School of Government with the Youth Bridge, Kenya, together staged the youth convention for this year.
Yeah.
Under the theme of harnessing the demographic dividend of Africa, the youth inclusion factor.
Yeah.
And as part of that, I was given the responsibility to give the keynote address on transforming African economy, the challenge of debt.
Right. Yeah. And thanks to the likes of Alex Matera and Frederick Okango, thanks so much for that.
Yeah.
Look, you've seen the Gen Z wave sweeping across the continent. You've seen what it's done in Kenya. Can you see it? Is it happening across the continent?
Well, some of us have sounded warning about this. And all over Africa, we are all sitting on a keg of gunpowder because the youth, and there's virtually no exception in Africa where the youth are not angry. They are unemployed, they are unempowered, and they see nothing other than hopelessness. And in a situation like that, what you have from frustrated youth is anger. And when they have no hope, and if you really want to kill any human being, take hope out of his life.
Yeah.
And that is what is happening.
And they have nothing to lose.
And they have, well, if you have nothing to gain, you are jobless, you are not empowered, you are in poverty, and then you see your leaders, some of them in obscene affluence. Then what do you do? You are a human being, and the resources of your country is provided for that country by God for the benefit of all the citizens of that country.
Absolutely. I remember in 2011 when the Arab Spring was sweeping across North Africa, and then you came to Kenya a couple of years later, and we were talking about that, and then you coined a phrase that I remember all to this day. You said, from the Arab Spring, there'll be an African winter. Is this what's happening?
It's the beginning. And if no adequate attention is paid to the needs of the youth in Africa, the autumn will turn to winter.
And it'll be ugly.
It will be very ugly for all of us.
Tell me something, Mr. President. You seem to be like the peacemaker on the continent. Whenever there's a conflict, you show up. What is it about this democracy? or multi-partyism that we don't get?
I believe that, of course, when the colonial powers were leaving Africa, as they had to leave, they gave us or left us with what they know best: Western liberal democracy. My belief is that we have to rethink Western liberal democracy because it doesn't seem to be working for us. You see, you have as part of Western liberal democracy what they call loyal opposition. I have looked into most African languages. Opposition is enemy. And what do you do with enemy? You cannot talk of a loyal enemy. Now, that is what they had, because their liberal democracy emanated from monarchy. And of course, you can be loyal to monarchy. But in our own case, opposition is enemy. And what you do is crush your enemy. And so we have to rethink commonality, consensus. These are things that we understand and we practice in traditional African society.
But Mr. President, in your country, in Nigeria, a country of more than 200 million people, democracy seems to be working. You have like two major parties. You have People's Democratic Party, PDP, and you have Alliance for Democracy, AD. And they keep switching back and forth, back and forth. But here in Kenya, we have briefcase parties. They change every 5 years.
Even Nigeria, I don't think you got it right, with all due respect. For democracy, if what you are talking about of democracy is just election and going to vote every 4 years or every 5 years, to me that is not democracy. That is just one symbol of democracy. For me, democracy must be able to deliver what I call the dividend of democracy. And it does appear that in Africa, the dividend of democracy is not being delivered. So we have to then go back to the drawing board and say to ourselves, well, we are not getting what we should get, so what should we do about it? I call it, should we look at something? It's true, it will still be democratic, but should we look at something that has African content in it? African context and African content.
Speaking of which, you were there at the advent of NEPAD,
yes.
New Economic Power for African Development. Yeah. You were there when OAU switched to AU. And now, years later, are we on the right track?
Well, we have AU. That's the best thing we can have as a continental organization. But is it doing enough? Well, when OAU transformed into AU, we had some aspects of the Constitutive Act that were different from OAU. For instance, we now have Peace and Security Council of AU. We didn't have that before. We now have something they call Council of the Wise. We didn't have that before. And if I can also say two things that AU had tried to do, and which I participated. AU tried to intervene in South Sudan when there was, and I was chair of the inquiry, but the report of the inquiry, AU could not implement it. But AU did, for the first time, setting up an inquiry. And about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, the situation in Ethiopia between the Tigray province and the central government of Ethiopia. AU appointed me as the high representative of the AU in the Horn of Africa, and that seemed to have worked. For the first time, AU took action, and we had what you may rightly call finding African solution to African problem. All the people involved were African.
Has it worked, Mr. President?
Yes.
Has it worked?
It has worked. It has worked. We had the Pretoria Agreement, and that Pretoria Agreement is being implemented.
Okay,
we are not fully at the end of all that we have to do. DDR, IDP is going back, but we are moving, and it's working.
And look at Sudan now. Look at the greater Sudan. It's a mess.
Yes. What I will say is that Sudan can copy Ethiopia, and AU and Africa can make Sudan follow the example of Ethiopia. If it has worked in one country, it can work in another.
What about the wave sweeping across your part of the continent, the Sahel, from Niger to Mali to Burkina Faso to Senegal? Look at the way coup d'etats in 2024. Does that make sense?
Well, change of government in a non-constitutional way is against AU. And nobody would want that. But what we should also look at is this. What are the causes? I always say, don't just look at symptoms. Look at the disease. What are the causes? And almost in all of these countries, almost all of them, there was jubilation in the street when the change of government, the non-constitutional way, comes about. And then I went to one of these countries. I spent 2 nights to try and really find out. And what I found was that these countries, or these young people, are not thinking of being in government for 3 years, 4 years, and and go back to barracks or retire.
Absolutely.
They are thinking of a generation.
Sure. Mr.
Their aim is, or their